Hey everybody, this is Rodney Elmer. Welcome to the Mountain Deer channel. We're going to talk a little bit of habitat and also two winter deer yards and maybe working on your property a little bit. Most of our experience is with deer that are in the northern part of the deer range, and winters are pretty harsh usually. Well, we get quite a bit of snow and quite a bit of cold, and we have mostly forests that we hunt in. For you fellows that are out there in the west and you're dealing with farms and fields, your habitat concerns and stuff will be way different than what we have here. In New England especially, with large, huge tracts of forest. Vermont is 7 million acres and 4.5 million of it is just woods. So woods are everything, and knowing your woods and what you're looking at is real important. If you are lucky enough to own a pretty good sized chunk of property and you want to do some work on it, I often look at the land around my land besides what I have, and I look at the different qualities of different lands around it. Most of us don't own enough land to really hold a deer, especially even a buck. But if you at least do something that your neighbors don't have, that can be a really good thing. Or I like to always do the opposite. With us, especially in New England with such cold winters and such deep snow, deer yards are probably the most important habitat of all. And our focus especially has been on that because the deer survivability is way more important. What I like to keep, especially on my property, I have about 100 acres, and part of it is a deer yard, is to have a lot of snags on my property. I like to have 4 or 5 like big blowdowns or big snags of some kind where the trees have fallen over, even if you do a cut and bend over, any of those are really good because birds will make their nests in there. The partridge can run away from the hawk in there. The fawn or the deer will lay down beside one of these, and like the coyote can't go through that 100 miles an hour. So having real clean people woods where you can walk everywhere and not come to one of these isn't necessarily real wildlife friendly. A mess is best most of the time, and these snags are a real important part of the habitat, and it's nature's way. Trees bust over, break down, crumble and fall in. It actually gives that soil a break from any growth, and it gives it a chance to come back a little bit, and all those nutrients will go back into the ground where they came from. Vermont at one time was a mostly agricultural state. It was forested. They opened it up, pastured a lot of it, and even this, about 90 to 100 years ago, was all pasture. Some of the species that grow and how they grow was really related to how people treated the land years ago. And of course, cows didn't eat hemlock, so we have lots of hemlock. They don't eat spruce or fir, so there's lots of those trees. And those are some of the oldest trees in our forest, and they're really important. Another thing that deer love is openings and dense areas and lots of edge everywhere throughout your property. So keep as much diversity on your property as you can and have the opposite diversity of whatever your neighbors have. If your neighbors have a lot of overhead cover, a lot of big giant hemlocks like a carport, a roof for them in the wintertime, but there isn't any food there, you should grow food. So I try and have openings where there's lots of raspberry bushes, young tree hardwood growth is real good, and I'll cut trees off, and I do it in the spring, and all the little small shoots that come out of the sides of the stump are a perfect food source for the deer. They grow extra fast because of that huge root ball feeding little tiny stems, and they're really nice and tender, and the deer love those, and that's some of the best. Another thing that's really important is to have a diverse tree age structure. Most deer yards are made up of really big older trees that make up a canopy, and then they're usually the largest population of trees in most deer yards. And cutting a deer yard isn't necessarily a great thing, and most states don't recommend doing it. Especially like the roof. When you cut the roof down and sacrifice that for the deer to eat, that can be, it's good, but it's not so good in the end. What's really nice about especially having a forest where you have the time to cut it quite a bit is that you'll have some young trees which will act as replacements, for the older trees as they go. And if you treat your forest a lot like a garden, and you pull some of the really big good carrots, you pull some of the thin, the crowded, the crooked, some of the ones, the species that aren't necessarily the greatest for deer, that'll add to your diversity, and it'll help your forest be more resilient. It'll stand up to bugs better, it'll stand up to logging or whatever you want to do in the future, even like a wave of a lot of deer, or like a moose suddenly moves in and starts chewing on things. It can make quite a difference. I've had a couple times where a moose has come in and they've eaten a lot of a specific species of trees and stayed for quite a while. And when you have everything just right, all the animals are going to want to be in your woods. Hemlocks, spruce, fir are really important to creating a roof for the deer in the wintertime, sifting the snow, and also to providing some thermal protection at night when it's really cold. Vermont especially is made up of soft, older ledge mountains, and there's lots of humps and bumps to the topography, and having some exposure that is warm and out of the wind is really important in any areas that have a lot of great big hemlocks. And they're also in a spot where it gets lots of sun, especially early in the morning, and it helps warm the deer up. It's great. Having a large enough tract of them is also important. You can't just have one little spot with something, because having a couple hundred acres is really good. If the deer start making little trails and they live inside that all winter long, they need space enough and room enough to run from, say, a coyote if it shows up. So they won't spend all of their time underneath one specific spot. They'll move around quite a bit. And it's important to have a large enough tract with the right exposure. Some places have the right ingredients but the wrong exposure, and the deer just won't use them. There's really no research or very much study that's been done on deer yards. And in the future, if especially the global warming thing gets going, and they'll be a little less important. If we get really bad winters every 4 or 5 years, it gives their yards a break, and having a little bit of diversity in the forest is really good. If you're going to work on any of these areas, try and leave the bigger, older trees and let them continue sifting snow. Take away the hardwood trees around the outside edges of it, and that'll help let some new growth come in. My property that I've owned I've been working on it for almost 30 years straight. And I've made some improvements to it, I want to believe. And one of my goals was to have it hold deer, and not necessarily year round, but to be real important during the summer and during the fall, where the does had cover enough that they wanted to have and birth their fawns on my land. So I made it thick and nasty, and lots of cover, lots of food, lots of differences in terrain and tree types, so that they would want to have their fawns there and stay there. Now, having lots of snags and stuff would also help keep the fawn protection up, right? And the babies of everything, grouse, songbirds, everything, so that was good. The other thing that you might want to consider when it comes to mixing like food plots and forestry is that you put your food plots in places where there's lots of security and cover for the animals to come and visit and not feel pressured. Also too, I wanted to make sure that I had lots of does around, especially during the rut. And the does felt comfortable rutting during the day. So I had big areas where I don't disturb it, it's fairly thick, and the does can feel free to run around while they're being chased by the bucks and not leave the property. So that was real important too. Real undisturbed areas. That was nice. When I have an orchard of apple trees, and it's big, I'll take 5 or 6 specific trees in different spots, and I will fertilize those. I'll put lime down and fertilizer around those trees, and that helps those trees in particular stay really healthy, really good, and the animals know the difference of which one's been fertilized and not. Just look at it when they get in your garden. They can't wait to eat all the stuff in your garden because it's well taken care of. And I do the same thing for specific areas, especially where I have a good tree stand location or something. I'll work on that. food plots are wonderful, and on a small scale especially, they can do a lot of good. The thing is, in general though, that food plots won't save an entire deer herd, but they do add to the fat reserves, and they add to the milk production of the does. So it's a really good thing to have lots of good summer feed, because it helps in an area where the winter isn't very good. At least it helps their fat production, so that's really important. The other thing is to use a lot of your natural vegetation. I put down lime and fertilizer on a lot of my just natural vegetation, the raspberry bushes and all those areas where there's lots of deer food on its own and it's growing there naturally. They love a lot of our natural native plants, and the more we help them, the better. One of the other things that can be kind of tough is the darn invasives, knotweed and all the different honeysuckle, buckthorn, there's tons of other ones. And sometimes if you're in an area with lots of invasives and you do lots of cutting, the invasives may take over and come even more. And the deer will use them for cover, but so will the ticks. And of course, they end up going after the native vegetation. The deer do when it comes to eating. They'll eat the native vegetation like crazy, and they'll actually help the bad stuff spread. And so it makes it tough, and you got to be careful with your cutting practices. I try to make sure that I don't lead some of even the roadside like chervil. Whenever I'm doing my logging practices, I make sure that I'm not making the dirt go from the woods all the way to the road, so that the birds will fly up my logging roads and spread the seeds all the way up through and end up invading my forest even faster. I like to have an area there where it doesn't lead everything in. I try and keep my my cutting spread out a little bit, and I'm doing one here, one there, one here, one there. Of course, the more you cut, the more you have to cut in the end. Cutting is a double-edged sword. People will say, oh, we want clear cuts and lots of them because it makes tons of food. But it's tons of food for 10 or 15 years, and then it goes the other way and it turns into poles. And then when it's in the pole stage of 4 or 5 inch trees, it doesn't take too long, and there's not even a fern on the ground. So you trade one for the other, and sometimes a constant coming back and cutting. It's a lot of work though, and most of us just don't have it in us to do enough acreage that'll really make a huge difference statewide or even countywide, but locally, and especially on your land, it'll make quite a difference. So it's worth doing. Here's what some of my work has turned into. It's taken me 30 years to grow those spruce to that height, and I've been slowly taking off the canopy, the overstory trees. They're like palm trees now. And I lay them down, and I take the tractor and slide them out, and I don't hurt my regeneration, and the regeneration is coming up beautiful, and someday this will be a new roof again. It's taken my whole lifetime to do it. That's kind of the discouraging part. I didn't think it'd take quite this long to get it all back going again, but someday when that part we were just visiting, that older part of the yard, when that's gone, this will take its place. So I'm doing the opposite of what's going on around me, and that'll help keep it diverse, and it'll help protect it. So to summarize a little bit, maximize your diversity for tree ages and tree types. Think about space, food, cover, and water, always. Also, think about how you're going to use your land in order to maximize and get the most enjoyment out of it and the most success. A lot of people get a lot of satisfaction from working on their property, and it really is satisfying. When you see a deer eating something that you wanted them to eat and they're enjoying it, that is a really good feeling. And in the end, it makes a connection between man and the land that's an important one. And man will be a little less of a user and more of a helper when it comes to nature. That, especially as our channel continues and we have some theories and thinkings a little bit, we'll try and shed some light on some of that, because I think someday the hunter especially is going to become like the guide, and he should be the best example of good husbandry when it comes to the land. Take care and enjoy your property and enjoy other people's. Have lots of respect for all of life and be part of it.
Thank you guys so much for watching. Hit that like button if you like this video. Subscribe if you haven't already, and we will see you in the next video.